So today I'm going to do a little bit more on text sets and kind of build off of what we did last class. I think that this is a really important idea, especially when you're looking at content and we're talking about building background knowledge. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this strategy. So we're going to over a curricular model that allows for purposeful use of text sets, and we're going to kind of prepare you for what it would take for you to plan your own text sets. So the first thing I want to think about is whether or not we're creating what we would call a multimodal or multi-genre text set. And so what we want to be thinking about is, are we giving lots of text types, and are we also giving lots of modalities to work in? So, and the opening video last week talked about this idea that texts are, like, anything can be a text, and that's really important. And it's really important for us to consider whether or not we are allowing our students to access that information using the different modalities, because you never know. Like they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and in some ways it really can be. You think about some of the ways that some of the more. I'm a graduate of Kent State, and so the iconic video of the May 4th shootings at Kent State, like that picture for me was probably one of the more riveting aspects that really drew me into wanting to know more about and understand this historical event that was so important to my campus. And so, like, that picture said 1,000 words, and for another student it might have been a poem, or it might have been the song for Dead in Ohio, or so we have to think about, are we bringing the students into the text in a multiple of ways, not sure what one maybe is going to really draw the student in, and maybe understanding that each of them is probably going to kind of round out or contextualize the learning in a different way. So one thing I want to point out is, a lot of times teachers, we teach reading, we're reading teachers, we go right to the text, and I want you to think about the fact that about a quarter of the brain is occupied in processing visual information, far more than any other sense. It takes, we are constantly bringing in visual information, and we are constantly making meaning out of it. It's very, very complex, and it is something that we, while we do it all the time, to do it thoughtfully and critically is something that our students need practice with. And because the world is so visual, that's the other thing. Students are constantly being bombarded with visuals, so it would be good to help them to really think about what those visuals are really saying and become critical of them. So one of the other things that I want to talk about is the transactional theory of reading, which we go into a lot more in EMR501, but it's that idea that we make meaning from a text when we transact with it. So the transaction between the reader and the written word is really the important space. It's very, very important that we understand that our students are bringing themselves to the text, as well as the text bringing itself to the student. And so when we're thinking about that, we have to think about the reader in terms of their personality, their skills, their background, their interests, their purpose, their mood, their physical state. And then we also have to think about that reader, those students, what kind of format, genre, what kind of content are we offering those students in order to get them to transact? Because if they don't transact with the text, they're not making meaning with the text. So what I'm going to go over is, this is something, this is a model for text sets. Initially, I'm going to show you that comes from Sarah Brown Westling. She was the National Teacher of the Year, I want to say in 2012. She's a very strong leader she was really a strong leader in the transition to the Common Core. She has some great stuff that you can get through NCTE and you can get through Amazon. So wanted to share with you, I took a webinar with her, led by her, early on in the transition to the Common Core, and it was her work on text sets that really helped me to understand and sort of re-center myself on what it means to be a literacy teacher in the Common Core. I think really up until this, I almost had thought that the Common Core was just kind of a little bit more of the same. So what her model talks about is, really, we have to have we have to think of text sets in terms of three different sort of functions. In the very center of the text, and that overlaps all three of the texts, is the theme or the essential question. And so we want our students, this is really the heart of it. And writing a good essential question, things like that are very important. Then what she talks about is this fulcrum text. And she was an English teacher, so the fulcrum text for her would be a piece of literature or maybe a longer work in the, but you could also consider it like the content too. Maybe the fulcrum text is in fact your science book or your social studies book. Maybe it's a Scholastic news article. The fulcrum text then is something that has to have a lot of layers and meaning. It has to be complex. It's what we want to get. It's what we're spending our time getting our students to think about. And so it has to have some real depth to it. And so to help our students get the most out of that fulcrum text, so going back to my first lecture, that fulcrum test would have, when I talked about the shift to the Common Core, would have been, Lord of the Flies. In order to help my students to really get the most out of that fulcrum text, I want to think about two other kinds of text that my students can think about. And those two other kinds of texts are context texts and textured text. Okay, so context texts are going to help my students to build up maybe some of the background knowledge. They're going to maybe help my students to really be able to understand maybe a little bit about the author, the time period. And the texture texts then are going to kind of put my text, they're going to illuminate my text, they're going to put my text in conversation, they're going to make me stop and think about the text. So the fulcrum text then is the point of the unit. It's traditionally the whole class text. If you're working in a different format, it might be, if you're working in reading groups, maybe it is maybe you have people reading in groups based on a theme, but they're all reading different books that are more leveled towards them or geared towards their interest. But it's that point of the unit. And in a content area, it might be the content itself. And you can think of it as in terms of the content. So when we are looking at, putting something in front of our students that we're going to spend a significant amount of time looking at, we really want to think about whether or not it's rigorous. We want to think about whether or not it's really stretching our students. And we want to think about, is it building what is already learned, and is it going to get them somewhere that they can use later, okay? So those are all things that we want to think about. We really want to think about, we don't want to spend a lot of time on something that really doesn't have that kind of complexity or importance to it. So then once I build a text, or I've picked my text, I want to think about context texts, and these are the ones that are accessible to students, and they give them a reservoir of prior knowledge. They let them understand the context. They're usually very short. They usually maybe have some historical background. Maybe they're helping the students to understand something about the author, the speaker, but those things are trying to build prior knowledge. Maybe it's about helping them to understand the vocabulary that they're going to need. So the context text, it usually would replace any pre-reading strategies that gave the mysteries or discoveries away. So where maybe a teacher would give somebody a lecture on, World War II before they read The Boy in the Striped Pajamas and, gave the students the historical background. These, instead, the students learn about World War II, and they learn about concentration camps on their own. These can be differentiated, so you can think about, you might have some students, maybe you have an English language learner student who's going to need a lot more background than another learner. So you can think about that, and you can differentiate. And some digital platforms even allow you to push out different material to different students that can get them prepared for the reading. The textured text, usually you bring that in sometime, after they've read the fulcrum text or after they've read at least part of the fulcrum text. And really what it tries to do is it tries to kind of juxtapose the fulcrum text. It is, the texture is created in the relationship between the two texts. So maybe it is somebody who has a totally different perspective. Maybe it's somebody who has some that like in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. Maybe it's helping them to understand something like what propaganda is, and understanding how some of this happened. Maybe it's to help them to understand the family dynamics and why this little boy didn't question his father and the boy in the striped pajamas. And so you do some texture text where you help them to understand family dynamics. And so these are texts that really, there has to be a relationship and it has to be an important connection. But they tend to be more complex than the context texts. The context texts are purposely very short, purposely very accessible. These ones your students might work very hard on. I used to like to bring in very short excerpts of philosophy. I was teaching high school students, and philosophical writing is really hard to read. So I would just bring in maybe 4 paragraphs of a philosopher. Let's read these 4 paragraphs of Kant and see if you can understand what he's saying, and then apply that to the literature that we just read together or something like that. So that is something to consider. Texture text can also be movies, and that could be something that you can consider. Even with the boy in the striped pajamas, maybe it could be that movie and have them looking at and comparing the presentation of the story visually versus in the written form. Texture texts make for good extended writing. They allow for differentiation because the students can come to the text as much or as little as they're able, but you want to make sure that you're getting something so that everybody can bring something out of it. It's a good place to bring in difficult texts that are stretch texts. Like I said, I like to bring in the philosophy. And these should definitely be complex. So poetry is a texture text. A poem is often a very good texture text to have because poems often are very difficult for students because there's a lot of inferential thinking that they have to do. So what makes a strong text versus what makes a weak text set? A strong text set builds a student's background knowledge. It has meaningful connections to the anchor text. A weak text, the connections are either very superficial or not there at all. Strong text sets have authentic, rich texts that are worthy of study. And a weak text set is all just more of the same, more textbook, more curated text, things that are very inauthentic. A strong text set has a range of text types. They're literary, they're informational, all kinds of genres, and they have different modalities, written, visual, whereas a weak text set really only focuses on one genre, maybe only on one modality. A strong text set is complex and it supports students' achievement of really complex reading. It's really about developing their critical reading skills. A weak text set, it's erratic levels. It's not really about developing that critical thinking. A strong text set presents a variety of perspectives, whereas a weak text set maybe limits their views and their perspectives. So, sorry, I don't know, I had that twice. So as an example then, I was doing some research on this, and I was looking at, I looked at the Iowa Core, which is like the Iowa Department of Education, and they had this example of a weak and a strong text set. And so for the strong text set, what they had was both of them had the anchor text of the 13th, 14th, that's supposed to be 14th, let me fix that, 14th, 145th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But and they had this as their essential question: were African Americans really free during Reconstruction? And so for the strong set, take a minute to look at the difference. I'll just give you a second to look at the difference, and try to figure out, thinking about what I said makes a good text set. So what I wanted to point out then is what makes the strong one strong, other than the fact that it's obviously much longer. I want to point out the weak text set is not without merit. I mean, anything that has Frederick Douglass in it, it's got merit to it, right? But the connections are kind of tangential. It's not clear why the teacher chose one to support the student's knowledge building. The stronger set is more focused. The anchor texts are the same, but in the stronger text sets, the texts that they provided are related. They're connected concretely to the topic of Reconstruction. Thematically, these texts provide a comment on the social and the political effects. And so the students are gaining knowledge of the social and political effects of Reconstruction through their reading and writing. It presents opportunities for connectedness and for the students to come up to respond individually to themselves and to make some discernment. It has a lot of context for close analytical reading. You know, there's a lot of authentic text there. There's a lot of primary source. There's a lot of primary source material there. So you can see that that strong text set offers the students a lot of different perspectives, a lot of complex texts, things that they can really sink their teeth into, builds their knowledge so that they can come to their own individual idea in response to that essential question. So when we are thinking about, the very first thing we have to think about is that anchor text and that anchor question. And when we're thinking about what anchor text and what anchor question to bring, we really want to think about this in terms of our students. You know, what are our students, you know, what will get under their skin, what will get them interested, what will get them questioning, what will get them engaged. When we think about the thinking that we want them to do we want them to be creative? Do we want them to be analytical? Do we want them to be, to develop an argument? So really you want to think in a lot of ways, you want to think about what is your end goal? What are you, backwards design? What do you want to accomplish in this unit? And then the content, you want to think about what disciplinary concepts, what skills do you want, what knowledge do you want them to build, and why is that important? And so when you are considering your anchor text or fulcrum text, as the earlier would have said, you want to think about those three things. Then you go out and you find your text, and your anchor text is generally going to come out of your curriculum, but your texture text, your context text, you can do a lot of sleuthing. I've spent hours and hours. I can really get down a rabbit hole creating text sets. But you want to think about museums, and you want to think about archives, and you want to think about different places where you can really find text sets or find text that you can put into your text set. Then the next thing I want to do is you really want to evaluate the text. You want to, after you've developed a list of texts that you want to use, you want to ask, are you building your students' knowledge? Are you giving them something worthy? Are you offering them a balance? Are you pushing them to complex thinking, to complex reading? I found this template, and what I want to encourage you is it's not going to be right. You're going to keep working on text sets. So, we need to let go of this mindset that we're going to develop something and use it for years and years and years, because we're constantly needing to. But there are a lot of resources online. We sort of started to look at that last week. But I want you to keep thinking about templates, PLCs, student responses. Find ways to reflect on what's working and what isn't working on your text sets. So, all right. Thank you very much. And we're getting to the end of the semester.